in celebration of 10 years of Mega Man, Mega Man 8 was the Blue Bomber's first title of the 32-bit era, which saw Mega Man, Proto Man, and Bass hit the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn with busters blazing in early 1997. And it was made to be different. Quite different, as Capcom set out to demonstrate from the moment the system startup faded out. Long influenced by various anime and manga, Mega Man now finally had an anime sequence to call his own.
The hardware had changed, and though I was the main artist up until 7, in 8 I turned to producing. We put in things like animated scenes, although the studio was an hours-long trip by train. I'd wanted to put in animated scenes since the first game, and it was great fun as you can imagine. We got to show some of the older enemy characters in a highlights-like fashion, and I'm still pleased with how it came out.
The inclusion of fully animated cutscenes also gave way to a slightly more elaborate plot than most fans of the original series were used to, as a robot from outer space named Duo chased an unnamed evil rival across the cosmos, with their battle finally taking them to Earth, where they fell into the hands of Doctors Light and Wily, respectively. Wily began to use the evil energy of the robot he captured as a new power source for his creations, while Duo wound up in the hands of Dr. Light, who attempted to repair the strange creature from the stars as best as he could. As it happens, the plot wasn't originally meant to span the stars, but was originally a little more down to earth, with a familiar old hand set to play a role.
I got to design Duo, but since he was initially intended to be a robot created by Dr. Cossack, his design still has Russian traits left over. For instance, his head design has vestiges of Russian headwear, and the 4 divots on his chest were put in with buttons in mind. But afterwards it was decided he'd come from outer space. This story of good and evil coming from space gives a hint to a movie I like a lot.
While the animation was decent enough, there's one thing which made players wince from the first time they played, and some still to this day: the voices.
Dr. Light, what is the problem?
A strange meteor has fallen to Earth just a while ago.
The story and sound were not the only thing to get beefed up from the increased power, however. Some of the most unique robot masters ever appeared, such as the 2-headed Searchman, Swordman, whose body was formed from 2 separate parts, and the enormous Frostman, whose giant body led to a larger arena than the norm for robot masters. But as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The 4 then 4 style of fighting bosses pioneered by the Game Boy titles and then carried on by Mega Man 7 returned, now with self-inclusive weapon cycles. In other words, none of the weapons from the first 4 bosses would give you much of an advantage against any of the second 4. However, the separation of the Robot Master lineup did have one advantage to the developers. It allowed them to interject a middle stage, complete with more cutscenes. In addition to the bosses, their stages also introduced several new ideas. Some worked to mix up the platforming aspect to some degree, such as Astroman's mazes and Swordman's ancient temple puzzles. Others changed the gameplay up more significantly, and, in at least one case, more notoriously. For the first time since Mega Man 5, Mega Man took up the use of vehicles and auto-scrolling segments. The first of these saw the return of the Rush Jet, which rather than being used for crossing spiked pits, was instead used for classic arcade-style shooter action. The other, however, can be summed up in just 2 words.
Jump! Jump!
Perhaps the most notorious addition to the gameplay was the addition of fast-paced rocket-powered snowboard sections, which would bark these directions at you in an ever-growing and more constant pace. As a result, the platforming really gets hectic, and would you cut that out already? Needless to say, this is one of fans' most grating things to deal with when playing the game. One difference that fans may notice is that many of Mega Man's supporting characters were pushed into lesser roles for Mega Man 8. While Rush has always been Mega Man's faithful sidekick, he took up much more of the spotlight in Mega Man 8 than he had in past iterations. While his jet mode was reserved for but a handful of segments, he would join his master in cutscenes, as well as provide many more forms and uses for the Blue Bomber that were formerly handled by others. Throughout the game, he acts as a communicator for Mega Man and Dr. Light, a tactical strike bomber, an item transport, and even a motorcycle. Now, Otto, Eddie, and Beat would only show up in cutscenes and as part of Mega Man's Air Force during the shooter portions of Tengu Man and Dr. Wily's stages, provided you were able to pick up the icons which would summon them. But while Rush stole the spotlight from his friends, one was left to question the actual usefulness of many of his forms. Another change in the gameplay came from the use of items and power-ups. As noted, Otto and Eddie were no longer in charge of producing items for Mega Man. That task instead fell to his sister Roll, who now offered power-ups which included more lives when beginning a stage, faster sliding, and different effects for Mega Man's charge shot. Conspicuous by their absence are the longtime staple of Mega Man games, the energy tanks, which are not found anywhere in the game, thus making some encounters a more frustrating ordeal than they would have been previously. In addition, bolts have since become much harder to find, usually tucked in out-of-the-way places. And even if you get them all, you won't be able to afford everything in Roll's shop, so you have to choose carefully. However, Capcom did not leave players to struggle on their own, instead balancing things out to a degree some have called too easy. With stages now being broken into two parts, Mega Man would see his energy reserves refilled in between. Furthermore, whenever Mega Man would lose a life, his weapon energy would also be refilled, thus making some encounters a little more tolerable, such as the Wily stage boss who can only be defeated by hits from the Mega Ball weapon, but could prove to be difficult to hit. Mega Man 8 was a game originally destined for Sega's Saturn console of the time, but according to former Tips and Tricks editor-in-chief Chris Bieniak, Sony had allegedly demanded the game, fearing it would give an advantage to its then rival. But in spite of this, it's also said that companies with pulls, such as Capcom and Konami, were actually forced to blackmail Sony of America by threatening to withhold the release of bigger 3D titles, such as Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid, in order to get their 2D fare released on the PlayStation in the US. And so the game did make its way, by hook or by crook, to both consoles in the US and Japan. But while Sony did get their own version of the game, the Saturn version was the version of choice for die-hard fans, as it held many features that the PlayStation version did not. Among these were different music, including Tengu Man's entirely separate theme, additional enemies and effects in the stages, a bonus mode, which featured official and fan artwork, voice and music tests, and a secret animation test for the cutscenes, and even two bonus Robot Masters from past games, Cutman and Woodman, who were each in charge of guarding bolts from the players and re-rendered in full 32-bit glory. Though it did eventually become a greatest hits title for Sony, sales of Mega Man 8 were not what Capcom had hoped, beginning a fall for the series into a state of relative obscurity within the franchise over the next 11 years. A follow-up game, known as Rockman Forte, was released shortly afterward for the Super Famicom as one of that system's very last games. The graphic style was lifted from Mega Man 8, including many enemies and characters, and even two of the Robot Masters, Tengu Man and Astro Man. That game won't arrive in the US until years later, but that's a story for another time. Duo would return in the second arcade title, Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters, which was actually released in arcades the year prior to Mega Man 8's home release, yet took place after the events of Mega Man 8. He would later make a cameo in the Mario Kart-styled racer Mega Man Battle and Chase, which Sony of America axed in the 11th hour, and would not see a US release until the later Mega Man X collection. The ex-cosmonaut robot would then not be seen again until he decided to be a jerk and kill everyone on the internet. But most of all, in spite of side stories, arcade titles, re-releases, and other spin-offs, Mega Man 8 would be long remembered as the last true classic series game. That is, until 11 years later, when Capcom, Keiji Inafune, and Inti Creates made the decision to turn back time.